Now, I would like to situate the importance of curriculum not vis-a-vis its comparison to 2005, but in the context of the fact that we are talking about a curriculum framework which is sort of being brought out as a part of the implementation of NEP 2020, and the importance of this curriculum framework in terms of trying to reflect the transformations that NEP 2020 has envisaged. So all of us, I think, over here would accept the fact that the NEP 2020 is not a reform document. It is a transformative document. And by that, I mean that any reform might be a minor one. Whereas when you talk about transformations, you're looking at transformations in terms of structural changes, in terms of processes, in terms of the way we find institutions responding to changing requirements. So it's much more at a very major level that we're looking at. Now, NEP 2020 came out after a long gap of nearly 3 decades, whereas the NCF that we are looking at is coming after a gap of about 15 to 17 years only. Now, NCF that we are currently looking at has to be situated within the NEP 2020 in terms of the larger macro picture that NEP 2020 has sort of put forward. So the curricula, and since we are trying to focus only on the curriculum part of it and not on too much of the pedagogy, though it's very difficult really to talk about curriculum by, disaggregating it from maybe pedagogy or from assessment and so on, because it's all a part of that same package. The curriculum would reflect the manner in which the pedagogy has got to be carried out, and that pedagogy would take into account the kind of assessment that we look at. So it's very really difficult to talk about it quite differently or distinctly separate. But the larger picture is in terms of how we approach the curricula that is necessary, rightly as Dr. Sri Kumar says, in this context where you need to have students with the right kind of knowledge, skills, and capabilities that we look at for in a 21st century learning environment. Now, the curricula has to be responsive, just as a policy is responsive to changes that happen within the society. And that's why I keep saying in every talk that I give on the NEP, that NEP 2020 has not been brought out because of some inadequacies in the National Policy on Education 1986. Let us not look at it as being a kind of course correction of 1986. That policy situated at that time, and many of us who are sitting here are beneficiaries of that policy, which has to undergo changes because of changes that happen globally within the society, like the onset of the information and communication technologies, that we are living in a globally connected world, that we have disruptive technologies threatening the kind of jobs that our youngsters would be looking at, and the fact that we are committed as a nation to the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as being a nation having the youngest or the largest young population in the world. But curriculum is also responding to those changes. And what are those changes, and what should be the importance of that curriculum in today's context? It would obviously flow from the NEP to a great extent, but since we are largely talking about school curriculum, I would like to say that just as curriculum for both higher or that embedding the technical and school have different functionalities, the school curriculum carries greater weightage in terms of the fact that it shapes the individual altogether. Whereas a curriculum that comes into the context at higher education is more in terms of looking at how do we empower our students for a world of work, to make them more resilient, to make them adjust to maybe changing workplace environments, and so on. Whereas actual values, actual character building, the perceptions that we instill in our students, those all take place in the curricula that happens at the school level. So all of us here know that the NEP 2020 talks about 4 new curricular frameworks: the curriculum framework for early childhood care and education, the curriculum framework for school education, the curriculum framework for teacher education and the curriculum framework for adult education. And the closest linkage are the first three curriculum for ECC and for school education and teacher education, not so much for adult education. Now, this curriculum that we are looking at must be situated in the context of the fact that the nature of knowledge that we are looking at in the 21st century has completely changed. And what is it that has made it completely changed? At the turn of the century, we moved from an information-based society to a knowledge-based society. When we say we move to a knowledge-based society, it talks about the interconnectedness and the integration of knowledge domains, which calls for the disappearing of what we say are hard separations in curricula. What is core subjects, what is extracurricular, what is co-curricular, and so on. So the nature of that knowledge has to get reflected in the curriculum. And thereby, the first need and importance of that curricula in the 21st century, and we're looking at a student who is likely to pass out after 17 years of schooling, sometime by about 2035 or 2037 or so. Let's say by 2040. That kind of student coming out has to have a very holistic, integrated learning. So the curricula has to be, not for the sake of using it as a cliche term, that it has to be multidisciplinary. It has to focus on being multidisciplinary. So when, as a committee, we are looking at holistic learning, and holistic because of the fact that we need to combine not just knowledge and capabilities, but attitudes also. It needs, from the point of view of knowledge, as being multidisciplinary, integrated in terms of understanding that all abilities and competencies of children and talents and potential of children have to be nurtured. And that is why in the NEP document, I keep saying to people, to find the consistency in the recommendations, go through the 22 cardinal principles that we have given in the chapter 1, where it states at the very beginning that it is the function of an education system to identify, recognize, and nurture the unique potential of every child and contribute to his or her holistic development. The curricula should be exactly reflective of that principle. And that principle calls for flexibility in approaches, multiple pathways that we need. So curricula should have an ability not just to be dynamic in terms of being ever evolving, but it has also got to give options to children to have flexible choices that they make in the curricular choices. That is flexibility in the curricular choices, flexibility in the language options, flexibilities in the way teachers can transact that curricula, flexibility in the way we assess children, and therefore that aspect where we come to the critical thinking and analysis. But the second dimension of the importance of curricula arises from the learning aspect. The multidimensionality of learning, which all of us have read in the Delors Commission report, the 4 pillars of learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together and with others, and learning to be. So holistic learning and holistic knowledge combined with a kind of holistic approach arises from these 2 critical characteristics of knowledge and learning, which is embedded within the curricula itself. Now, the importance of curricula arises, as I said at the beginning, you cannot really separate it so much from the pedagogy part of it and from the assessment part of it. But the third dimension that I would just like to say is that the curricula should allow for creativity of children, their honing of the cognitive abilities, their critical analysis capabilities, which means that the curricula must be sort of assessed from the learner's point of view, not from the point of memorizing, but from the point of analyzing that content. And therefore, the approach to curricula itself has got to be one that sort of engages creative imagination, that sort of inspires children to go beyond and look out of the box, to start thinking in a manner which is not structured and which is closing their minds from seeping in of other new domains of learning that they come, and it comes in tidbits to them. It comes in various ways to them. And this whole exercise of knowledge, learning, and the moving away from the road-based learning, all this has to look at another dimension of making learning as an activity being a very enjoyable activity. I think we have the curriculum that we are looking at, and with all due respect to the existing curriculum framework, the load of it was so much that it added to the stress of learning rather than the joy of learning. And I think it is very important that when we frame this new curriculum, which is an elaborate exercise, a mammoth exercise, and we are framing it from the 4 stages of the 5+3+3+4, which is also related to the developmental stages of a child, that curriculum framework at all the levels must ingrain itself with flexibility, must ingrain itself to multiple areas of knowledge, but must be reducing the stress, not just of examinations, but also the stress of learning itself, where knowledge acquisition is seen as a kind of enrichment and something that is joyful, that has to be there at each stage of learning, particularly at early childhood care and education. But even when we go from the foundational to the preparatory and to the middle, maybe the highest stage where you can think of stress coming in is at the secondary stage. But I would put over here a caveat. We are seeing a lot of students succumbing to the pressures of examinations because of the heavy curriculum load and the pressure of marks, forcing them to go into coaching. So curriculum must lend itself to allow students to be able to self-learn themselves with minimal amount of a coaching culture that comes in. Now, coming to the content part of it, which Dr. Sri Kumar said that we must focus largely upon, the NEP has talked 2 ends. One side on the rooting of Indian traditions and cultures, given our civilizational strengths. And therefore, the Indian knowledge systems, the fact of strengthening languages in early schooling stages, these all are a part of that traditional part of it. And we have to respect that, because it ingrained in us various qualities of tolerance in terms of compassion, accepting diversity, and all these came in from that traditional approach that we had, which this country is so proud of as its civilizational culture. On the other side, it talks about data science, it talks about artificial intelligence and computers and so on. So you have 2 ends of the spectrum. In between all this, you have your standard core subjects that one learns of English or mathematics or social science and so on. And then you need to look at the skilling part of it that needs to come in, because you need to embed the vocationalization, because just as knowledge and capabilities are important, the multi-skilling requirements of a changing economy is something that we need to recognize, and we need to give that to our students. The other aspects come in terms of being environment conscious, being inclusive by nature, where we are sensitizing them to gender, sensitizing them to the multicultural society that we live in. We are conscious about climate change. We are conscious about our flora and fauna, our forests. We are conscious about what we talk in terms of requirements of becoming a global citizen. So the curricula, in terms of looking at the breadth, is very, very vast. The challenge is you need to weave this in, not in terms of separate subject exposures, but incorporate that within the same subjects that you teach, so that you're not going to have a school day which looks like 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening, talking of all these subjects which I just told you. How do you bring in climate change and environment sensitivity? It can come into your geography subject. How do you talk about multiculturalism? It can come in within your language subject, or it can come in within your history subject and social science. Weaving in that, along with the 21st century skills of having the collaborative learning abilities, looking at how to manage team, how how to manage your time, handling socio-emotional issues. So I'm happy that we had in the introductory an attempt to try and say that this is very, very critical. So the fact that the curricula should enable the socio-emotional well-being of a student, the physical fitness in terms of sports, in terms of using the methods by which their physical well-being is also promoted, and not treating that as being less important to maybe any other subject, as being very equally important. And that is the criticality of the NEP 2020, where all subjects should be given an equal weightage. So the curriculum framework must not put a premium on some subjects vis-a-vis other subjects. It must be a kind of a mosaic where all these get dovetailed, and the schools will have to subsequently, after the curriculum comes out, and we would have to have the NCFTE when it looks at how the teacher preparation has to take in, to look at these dimensions of it. I think I'll just stop with one point. Education, as we all know, is a subject in the concurrent list, and we have our director from SCRT Kerala, which is doing the part relating to the state curriculum framework. The NEP itself recognized that the curriculum framing has to take into account regional requirements, local flavors, have textbooks which can bring in the local context and so on. I think respecting this federal structure and allowing the states to have its own spaces of maneuverability in terms of the macro picture and in terms of the local picture, and balancing it in such a manner that students in a given state are not put to a disadvantage to another state, is also an equally important part of the curriculum exercise.